let's talk about EMS narratives. So for me in school, we didn't really hit very heavy on our EMS narratives and our charting. Now this is something that is extremely important, and it is something we have to be very diligent about, and something that you really need to get in your groove. So if that is something you're struggling with, we're going to talk about that today. Be mindful that I am not an expert at charting. This is just what has worked for me. If you are looking for an expert in EMS charting, it's probably going to be a lawyer, to be honest, someone who has experience in law and things like that. I am just going to explain to you what has worked for me, what has gotten me in my groove for EMS charting, and we'll take it from there. We're going to talk about some basics. We're going to talk about being objective. We're going to talk about following a timeline, talk about chronological order of events. We're going to talk about documenting what our interventions were, our assessments, what the results were, what the results of our interventions were, they be good or bad. We're going to talk about documenting a full assessment every time. We're going to talk about the importance of documenting assessments on refusals. We're going to talk about, even if our patient refused that full assessment, the importance of informing the patient how important that assessment is and documenting that. We're also going to talk about just kind of the little niche things that kind of get overlooked when it comes to narrative writing and documentation. So first things first, we'll wrap it back to the beginning, keeping things objective. That just means we're not going to be talking about the things that we feel about the patient, the things that we feel about our environment. We're talking about exactly what we see objectively. So the patient was diaphoretic. The patient was shouting. The patient was X, Y, or Z. The patient stated, "I feel like an elephant is sitting on my chest," etc. We're making sure we're using clear and professional language. We're making sure we're not using obscure abbreviations and things like that. We're making sure we're using things that are very recognizable to medical jargon, not just our own, maybe regional jargon or things like that. And then next, following a timeline, we're making sure we're documenting the things we did in the order that we did them and any results that came from the interventions that we did. So sometimes patients may have negative or side effects from the interventions that we do, and we do need to document those things. It's not always our fault. Sometimes it is just a product or a consequence of some of the medications or the interventions we do. It's just part of medicine. So we need to make sure we're documenting those and any countermeasures that we took to mediate those side effects or negative effects of the interventions that we took. And then next, we need to talk about our assessment modalities. We need to talk about if there's any assessment portion that we didn't do. We need to talk about why we didn't do that assessment portion. And that means just like I was unable to assess the patient fully because they were combative. Make sure that we are documenting vital signs appropriately. I know that sometimes our monitors, if they're continuously trending vitals, they can kind of push in some weird vital signs. So just remember, if, for example, you get a weird blood pressure that has trended and you, for some reason, you're like, oh, I need to get a manual blood pressure, and you get an appropriate manual blood pressure, make sure that you are documenting why that was such a wonky blood pressure, things like that. About patient refusals, the biggest one. For me, if you've followed me for any amount of time, you've probably seen some of my videos, and I talk about patient refusals and how important it is to document patient refusals. So obviously it is our job to transport patients to the hospital, and not always do we do this, but when we don't do this, we need to make sure that we have done a full assessment if our patient allows us to do so. We've been called to the scene for a reason. They've called us to the scene, more than likely, and we need to make sure that we are assessing them appropriately, and we've completed our full vital sign and visual assessment. We need to make sure we're touching the patient, we're getting, medications, allergies, we're actually documenting all of this. Shows your due diligence. We need to try and find out maybe why the patient isn't wanting to go to the hospital and try to mediate this, and then documenting why. And we're explaining the risks also. What is the patient's current condition? We're explaining to the patient how that could possibly decline and we're explaining to them why it is necessary for them to see a physician and the limitations of EMS in the field. So documentation is so important, especially when it comes to leaving the patient on the scene to their own will. I know in some EMS systems we're using paper documentation for refusals. Some you're doing it digitally. Make sure you're obtaining the appropriate signatures and being sure that the patient is alert and oriented and not under any intoxicants, and being sure to call medical control appropriately and documenting that you did so. I'll pop up here an example of a narrative that may be helpful. This is one that I would say is similar to one that I may use. So for me, this is a narrative I would be using in a 911 setting. I'm going to give my dispatch my general impression, so how I'm going to respond to the call, and my general impression of the scene. I'm also going to explain any co-responders that were there prior to my arrival and any immediate interventions that I saw being done. Next, I'm going to give the chief complaint, and the chief complaint is what the patient states. So sometimes it may be more clear to put this in quotes. Patient states, "I feel like an elephant is sitting on my chest." And then I'll give a history of present injury or illness. So the patient explained that, and the patient has a history of these things. They don't have any allergies, or they do have allergies. This is their current living conditions, especially if they do live in a nursing facility or they're currently staying in a rehab facility, either for mental health or physical health. And then I'll explain if they have any implantable medical devices, things like pacemakers, defibrillators, and then I might go on to explain their code status. And with their code status, I may explain if they do have any advanced directives or living will aside from just a straight code status. And then I'll move on to my assessment. I'll give my full assessment. And then I'll move into my airway documentation, and then my cardiac monitoring documentation. And then moving on here, let's see. I'll do any changes in patient condition, whether they improved, stayed the same, or declined on the way to the hospital. And then I'll move down to any interventions that I performed on the way prior to transport. And then I'll talk about the transport and patient movement. So I'll talk about how I moved them, whether we used a stair chair or a mega mover, whether the patient walked to the ambulance. Sometimes, we have more than one patient on those multiple patient scenes. I'll talk about how I moved them out of the ambulance. I'll talk about how we rode to the hospital emergency traffic lights and sirens, no lights and sirens, etc. And then we'll talk about transfer of care and signatures obtained and how they were moved over from the stretcher to the hospital bed. And then I'll end my report, and I will make sure that all my documentation is complete. And I cannot stress this enough. I know some people that use dictation apps and things like that. Please don't use that. They are a little wonky sometimes, and they tend to say things that are exactly not what you were saying. And we don't want your documentation to be incorrect just for the sake of a little bit quicker documentation using some kind of AI device or dictation app. So be sure that you're rereading your documentation. And so that's a little example of how I like to do things. Remember, this is just an example. Make sure that you are following your local protocols, medical direction, and policies at your service. And this is only for educational purposes. If you do want some professional advice, like I said in the beginning, you're probably going to need to talk to a lawyer, because this is all legal mumbo jumbo that I do not know anything about. But legally, all of this documentation is very important. So get your groove, start practicing, and find what works for you. This just happens to be what works for me.